The Nebraska night was calm outside the diner. Rows of trucks rested beneath the parking lot lights, waiting for another day on the road. A faded blue Freightliner sat quietly near the edge of the lot. Its chrome reflected the warm glow of the lamps. Its paint carried the marks of countless years and countless miles. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. The diner had grown quieter as the night stretched on. Most travelers had already continued on their way. Carl and I remained in the same booth near the window. Coffee cups sat between us. The old Freightliner waited outside. Over the past few hours, Carl had shared stories about snowstorms, mountain roads, breakdowns, and long-haul runs across America. Stories collected over hundreds of thousands of miles. Yet it felt as though we had only scratched the surface, because every mile seemed to lead to another memory, and every memory seemed to lead to another road. Carl glanced toward the Freightliner. A small smile appeared beneath the brim of his cap. "You know something?" he said. "What?" The truck wasn't the most important thing I found out there. I looked at him curiously. Most drivers spend their lives talking about trucks, engines, repairs, horsepower. But Carl seemed to be thinking about something else entirely, something far beyond machinery. The road introduces you to people you'd never meet anywhere else. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. The steam drifted slowly into the warm diner air. You can forget a lot of truck stops. He paused for a moment. But you'll remember certain people forever. It happened somewhere in New Mexico, many years earlier, back when the Freightliner was still relatively young. The truck had already accumulated several 100,000 miles, enough to prove itself, not enough to become legendary. It was late summer. The desert heat had settled over the Southwest like a heavy blanket. Even after sunset, the air remained warm. The pavement continued radiating heat long after the sun disappeared. Carl had spent most of the day driving through Arizona, the kind of day where the horizon never seems to get closer. Miles passed slowly. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction. By evening, he crossed into New Mexico. The sky had begun changing colors. Orange, purple, deep blue. One of those sunsets only the desert seems capable of creating, the kind that makes you slow down just to appreciate it. Eventually, he pulled into a small truck stop, not a major travel center, not one of the giant chains. Just a fuel station beside the highway, a restaurant, a few parking spaces, and a lot of open desert. The sort of place most people forget. Carl parked the Freightliner near the edge of the lot. The engine ticked quietly as it cooled. The day had been long, nothing unusual, just another load, another destination, another stretch of highway. At least that's what he thought at the time. The sun had fully disappeared by then. Stars were beginning to fill the sky. Out in the desert, away from cities, the night sky feels different, larger somehow, closer. The darkness seems deeper. The stars seem brighter. Carl stood beside the truck for a moment, stretching his legs, taking in the evening air. That's when he noticed another driver. The man sat alone on a folding chair, a few parking spaces away. Nothing unusual about that. Truck drivers spend plenty of time sitting outside their rigs. What caught Carl's attention was the view. The man wasn't looking at his truck, wasn't looking at his phone, wasn't talking to anyone. He was simply staring at the sky for several minutes, without moving. Carl smiled slightly. The memory clearly amused him. At first I thought maybe he was waiting for somebody, but nobody arrived. The man remained exactly where he was, looking upward. Eventually, curiosity won. Carl grabbed a bottle of water and wandered over. The stranger glanced in his direction, then nodded politely. Evening, evening. The conversation might have ended there. Most truck stop conversations do. A greeting, a nod, then both drivers continue on with their lives. But this one didn't. Carl followed the man's gaze, looked toward the sky. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The stars stretched from horizon to horizon, thousands of them, maybe millions. Finally, the stranger smiled. Hard to find a sky like this anymore. Carl nodded. That's true. The man pointed upward. See that? Carl followed his finger. At first, he didn't notice anything unusual. Then he saw it. A faint streak of light crossing the darkness. A satellite, moving silently above the desert. The stranger smiled again. I've been watching them for years. Carl chuckled. Satellites. The man shook his head. Everything. His answer hung in the air for a moment. The stars, the moon, the clouds, the sunsets, the sunrises, everything. For the next hour, the two men sat beside the parking lot talking. Not about trucking, not about freight, not about engines. About life, about places, about things people notice when they spend enough time outdoors. Carl never even learned the man's last name. Yet decades later, he still remembered that conversation. Maybe because it happened at exactly the right moment. Sometimes strangers tell you things your friends never do. Not because they know you, because they don't. The desert remained quiet around them. The Freightliner rested nearby. The highway continued carrying travelers through the darkness. And beneath a sky full of stars, two drivers shared stories, knowing they would probably never meet again. Eventually, it grew late. Both men stood. Both wished each other safe travels. And that was it. No dramatic ending. No life-changing event. No grand lesson. Just a simple conversation beside a highway in New Mexico. Yet somehow, it stayed with Carl for years. He looked toward the Freightliner once more. The reflection of the diner lights shimmered faintly across its faded paint. You'd be surprised how many people leave a mark on your life. The words lingered between us. Outside, the night was beginning to feel softer, the parking lot quieter, the highway calmer, and I had a feeling that the man in New Mexico would not be the last traveler Carl remembered. After all, there were still hundreds of thousands of miles ahead, and somewhere among those miles waited more stories, more roads, more strangers, and more memories carried by an old Freightliner. The memory seemed to stay with Carl for a moment. The man from New Mexico had long since disappeared into the past, yet somehow, he still occupied a small corner of the road in Carl's mind. Maybe that's one of the strange things about trucking. You spend years meeting people for only a few minutes, and sometimes those few minutes last forever. Outside, the diner windows reflected rows of parked trucks. Most of their drivers were asleep by now, resting before another day on the road. The Freightliner sat quietly beneath the lamp. Its faded paint glowed softly in the darkness. Carl wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. The mug had grown warm again after another refill. There was another person. I smiled. I had expected that. The road is too long for only one memorable encounter. This story happened a few years later. The Freightliner had already crossed the country more times than Carl could count. California, Florida, Texas, Maine, Washington. The miles had begun accumulating quickly. The odometer spun steadily forward. So did life. One summer afternoon, Carl found himself crossing northern Arizona. The desert stretched endlessly around him. Dry hills rolled toward distant mountains. The air outside was brutally hot, the kind of heat that seems to vibrate above the pavement. Even inside the cab, the warmth was impossible to ignore. The Freightliner's air conditioner worked hard just to keep up. The truck had already covered several 100,000 miles by then. It remained dependable, but age was beginning to show. Nothing serious, just small reminders. A vibration here, a strange noise there, a leak that needed attention. The sort of things old trucks collect over time, like wrinkles on a face. Carl had learned not to worry about every sound. If he had, he'd never sleep. The Freightliner continued west, the engine pulling steadily through the heat. Hour after hour passed peacefully. The desert remained empty. The road remained straight. Then the temperature gauge moved. Not much, just enough to catch his attention. Carl glanced at it, then looked back at the road. A few minutes later, he checked again. The needle had climbed higher. Still not dangerous, but definitely unusual. He turned off the air conditioning, a trick every experienced driver knows. The cab immediately became warmer. The engine did not care. For a while, the temperature stabilized. Carl relaxed slightly. Then it climbed again, a little higher, then higher still. The Freightliner was trying to tell him something. Experienced drivers learn to listen. Carl eased off the throttle. The truck continued forward, but the gauge kept rising. That was enough. He switched on the hazard lights, guided the Freightliner toward the shoulder, and brought the truck to a stop. The desert stretched around him in every direction. Empty, quiet, endless. The engine shut down. Silence filled the cab. Carl sat there for a moment, looking at the gauges, listening to the ticking sounds of cooling metal. Then he sighed. The Freightliner had finally chosen an inconvenient moment to complain. Outside, the heat felt overwhelming. The sun still hung above the horizon. Even the wind felt hot. Carl opened the hood, mostly because that's what truck drivers do. I laughed. So you still didn't know what you were looking at? Carl laughed too. Not much more than before. The engine looked exactly like an engine. Complicated, expensive, and currently unhelpful. After checking what he could, Carl reached the only conclusion available. He needed help. The nearest town wasn't exactly close. Neither was the nearest repair shop. Cell phone coverage was unreliable. Back then, far more unreliable than it is today. For a while, Carl simply waited. The desert remained motionless. The highway remained mostly empty. A few cars passed. Several trucks rolled by. Most offered a friendly wave. Nothing more. Nobody stopped. And honestly, Carl didn't blame them. Hours passed slowly. The afternoon drifted toward evening. The sun lowered toward the horizon. The heat finally began easing. Long shadows stretched across the desert floor. The landscape softened. Eventually, another truck appeared in the mirror. Its headlights flashed once. Then the truck slowed. Carl watched as it carefully pulled onto the shoulder behind him. For a moment, he simply stared, because that doesn't happen nearly as often anymore. A driver climbed down from the cab. Older, thin, covered in grease. The man walked toward the Freightliner without any hurry, as if helping stranded drivers was a normal part of his day. Trouble? Carl nodded. Looks that way. The stranger glanced toward the open hood, then toward the gauges inside the cab. He didn't say much, didn't ask many questions. Instead, he spent several minutes looking, listening, thinking. The sun continued sinking behind the mountains. The desert slowly turned gold. Finally, the man nodded. I think I know what it is. Those 6 words sounded wonderful. Carl watched carefully. The stranger reached into a toolbox, adjusted something, checked something else, then adjusted another component. Nothing dramatic, nothing complicated, just years of experience at work. The sort of knowledge you can't learn from manuals, only from time. 20 minutes later, the man stepped back, wiped his hands on a rag. Try it. Carl climbed into the cab, turned the key. The Freightliner came to life immediately. The engine settled into its familiar idle. Smooth, steady, comforting. Carl glanced at the temperature gauge. Everything looked normal. For the first time all afternoon, he relaxed. The older driver smiled slightly. She'll get you home. Not it. She. Like many veteran truck drivers, he spoke about trucks the way sailors talk about ships. With respect, Carl stepped down from the cab, reached for his wallet. The man shook his head. No. Carl frowned. No. The stranger smiled. Somebody helped me once. The desert had grown quiet now. The first stars were beginning to appear overhead. Carl looked at him for a moment, trying to find the right words. None seemed good enough, so he simply thanked him. The older driver nodded, climbed back into his truck, and drove away, just like that. No business card, no last name, no address, only a memory. The Freightliner idled quietly beside the road, ready to continue. Carl stood there watching the taillights disappear into the evening. He never saw that driver again, but decades later, he still remembered him. Because sometimes a person changes your entire day without asking for anything in return. Sometimes that's enough to be remembered forever. Outside the diner, the old Freightliner remained beneath the lights, still waiting, still standing. And somewhere within its million miles were dozens of stories just like that one. Stories about kindness, stories about strangers, stories about people who appeared briefly on the road and somehow never completely left. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The stories seemed to linger between us, like the fading taillights of the driver who had stopped to help in Arizona. Outside, the parking lot remained quiet. A few trucks sat idling in the darkness, their marker lights glowing softly beneath the Nebraska night. The old Freightliner still rested beneath the lamp, patient as always. Carl looked at it for a moment, then nodded slightly. That wasn't the biggest breakdown. I smiled. I had been expecting those words. Every old truck eventually faces a real test. Not a minor repair, not an inconvenience, a genuine breakdown. The kind that leaves you wondering if the journey might actually be over. The Freightliner's test came years later. By then, it had already traveled well over 500,000 miles. Thousands of deliveries, thousands of nights, thousands of sunrises viewed through the windshield. The truck was older. Carl was older too. Both carried a few more scars. Both kept moving anyway. The trouble began in Nevada. Late summer. The desert once again. Carl laughed quietly. Seems like the desert always waits for the right moment. Maybe it does. The load wasn't unusual. Construction equipment heading west. Nothing oversized. Nothing complicated. Just another run across long stretches of open country. The day had started before sunrise. Carl remembered that clearly. The air was cool. The roads were empty. The sky slowly brightened as the Freightliner rolled through the darkness. For several hours, everything felt normal. The engine sounded healthy. The gauges looked perfect. No warnings. No signs. Nothing unusual. That was the frustrating part. Problems are easier when they announce themselves. This one didn't. By midday, the desert heat had fully arrived. The horizon shimmered beneath the sun. Mountains floated in the distance like mirages. Traffic remained light. The road stretched endlessly ahead. Hour after hour, mile after mile. Then Carl heard a sound. a sound that didn't belong. Not loud, not dramatic, just different. Truck drivers noticed those sounds immediately. Years of driving teach you the language of machinery. The Freightliner had its own voice, its own rhythm, its own collection of familiar sounds. This wasn't one of them. Carl lowered the radio, listened carefully. The sound came again, brief, metallic, then silence. For another 20 minutes, everything seemed normal. The truck continued pulling steadily. Then the sound returned, longer this time, a faint grinding noise, deep beneath the cab. Carl frowned. The Freightliner kept moving, but something wasn't right. A few miles later, the vibration started. Small at first, almost easy to ignore, then stronger. The steering wheel began trembling slightly. The floorboards vibrated beneath his boots. The truck was talking now, and what it had to say wasn't good. Carl eased off the throttle. The Freightliner slowed. The vibration remained. Then came another sound, a sharp metallic crack. Not loud, but unmistakable. The kind of sound every driver remembers. The kind of sound that instantly empties your stomach. Carl guided the truck onto the shoulder. The Freightliner rolled to a stop beneath the desert sun. This time he knew immediately. This wasn't a minor repair. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Carl climbed down from the cab, walked slowly around the truck. The desert stretched around him, silent, motionless. Nothing moved except the heat waves dancing above the pavement. After a few minutes beneath the truck, he found the problem, and his heart sank. A major driveline component had failed. Not something you repair beside the road. Not something you fix with basic tools. This was serious, very serious. The kind of failure that ends trips. The kind of failure that empties bank accounts. Carl sat on the edge of the fuel tank for a while, thinking. The Freightliner stood motionless beside him. For the first time in years, it felt vulnerable. Not old, not tired, vulnerable, like an old friend who suddenly looked their age. The afternoon passed slowly. Phone calls were made. Tow trucks were arranged. Repair shops were contacted. Each conversation seemed more expensive than the last. Eventually, the recovery truck arrived. A massive machine built for exactly this kind of situation. Even so, watching the Freightliner being prepared for towing felt strange. Almost wrong. The truck had carried Carl across 500,000 miles. Now it needed someone else to carry it. The sun was beginning to set when they reached the repair facility. A small independent shop outside a desert town. Not much to look at. Just a few service bays. Several trucks waiting for repairs. And years of experience hidden behind weathered walls. The owner greeted Carl with a tired smile. The kind of smile mechanics develop after decades of solving expensive problems. The inspection didn't take long. The diagnosis confirmed what Carl already suspected. The repair would be costly. Very costly. For a while, neither man spoke. Carl stared through the shop window. The Freightliner sat quietly outside, waiting. The mechanic folded his arms. "She's worth fixing." Carl looked at him. "You think so?" The mechanic nodded. "Absolutely." He pointed toward the truck. "Most trucks don't make it this far." The words felt important. Not because they solved the problem, because they reminded Carl why the problem mattered. The Freightliner wasn't just equipment anymore. It was years of memories, years of work, years of life. You don't walk away from something like that easily. The repair took several days. For the first time in years, Carl found himself without a truck, without a route, without a schedule. At first it felt strange, almost uncomfortable. Truck drivers become accustomed to motion, to destinations, to movement. Suddenly having nowhere to go felt unnatural. Each morning he visited the repair shop. Each afternoon he waited. And every day, the Freightliner slowly came back together, piece by piece, bolt by bolt, like a patient recovering from surgery. Finally, after nearly a week, the mechanic handed Carl the keys. The moment felt oddly emotional. Not dramatic, just meaningful. The Freightliner started immediately. Its familiar rumble filled the yard. The vibration was gone. The grinding noise was gone. Everything felt right again. Carl smiled as he settled into the driver's seat. For the first time during the entire ordeal, he relaxed. The mechanic stood outside the shop, watching. Before Carl pulled away, the man tapped the door. "Take care of her." The words sounded familiar. Years earlier, another mechanic had said nearly the same thing. Carl laughed softly. "Don't worry." He looked across the hood, at the truck that had already carried him through so much. "I plan to." Outside our diner, the old Freightliner remained beneath the lights, still standing, still working, and somehow, after hearing the story, I respected it even more. Because a million miles isn't just about the miles that happen. It's also about the miles that almost don't. The breakdowns survived, the setbacks overcome, the moments when quitting would have been easier. Yet somehow, both truck and driver kept moving. Carl finished the last sip of coffee in his mug, then looked toward the eastern horizon beyond the parking lot. The darkness seemed just a little lighter now. Morning was still some time away, but it was coming. And somewhere ahead waited another milestone, a number that few trucks ever reach. 500,000 miles had come and gone, yet the biggest number was still ahead. The diner felt different now, not because anything had changed, because the stories were beginning to add up. The old Freightliner outside no longer looked like an ordinary truck, not after hearing where it had been, not after hearing what it had survived. The faded paint, the worn chrome, the small dents scattered across the body. Each one seemed to belong there, like pages in a book. Carl looked through the window. For a moment, he appeared lost in thought. You know what surprised me most? I shook my head. What? 500,000 miles. I smiled. That wasn't the answer I expected. Most people imagine the million-mile mark as the big moment, the number everyone remembers. But Carl explained that reaching 500,000 felt more important at the time, because a million still seemed impossible. 500,000 was real. It was a number he could actually see approaching, a number growing closer with every trip. By then, the Freightliner had become part of his identity. Drivers at regular stops recognized the truck. Mechanics recognized the truck. Even dispatchers occasionally asked about it. "You're still running that old Freightliner?" Carl would always laugh. Still running. The answer never changed. The years passed steadily. Loads came and went. Customers changed. Routes changed. The truck remained. It crossed deserts, crossed mountains, crossed endless plains. Summer, winter, spring, fall. The Freightliner simply kept moving. Carl said those years blurred together in the best possible way. Not because they were boring, because they were consistent. Thousands of small memories, thousands of ordinary days. Trucking isn't usually made of dramatic moments. Most of it is quieter than people imagine. Long roads, sunrises, truck stops, coffee, the same routines repeated again and again. And somehow, that's exactly what many drivers grow to love. One evening, several years after the Nevada breakdown, Carl found himself heading east across Kansas. The sky stretched endlessly above him. Clouds drifted across the horizon. The road rolled forward in a straight line. Nothing unusual. The kind of evening that quickly fades from memory. Or at least it should have. The Freightliner hummed steadily beneath him. the engine pulling smoothly as it always had. The sun was beginning to set. Golden light covered the fields. Everything felt peaceful. Then Carl glanced down at the odometer. At first, he didn't think much about it. Then he looked again. The number was close. Very close. 500,000 miles. 500,000. A number that once seemed impossible. A number that now sat only a few miles away. Carl smiled. Not because he was excited. Because he was surprised. The years had passed faster than he realized. The Freightliner continued forward. The number continued climbing. 499,998. 499,999. Carl watched carefully. Then it happened. 500,000. The odometer quietly rolled forward. No celebration. No fireworks. No applause. Just another mile. And yet somehow it felt significant. Carl eased off the throttle slightly. Not because he needed to. Because he wanted to appreciate the moment. The road stretched ahead. Empty and peaceful. The Freightliner rolled onward. Exactly as it had for hundreds of thousands of miles before. Carl laughed softly as he remembered it. I actually pulled over. You did? He nodded. Couldn't help myself. The shoulder was wide. The evening was calm. Carl parked the truck and stepped outside. The Kansas wind moved gently through the grass. The sunset painted the horizon in shades of gold and orange. For several minutes, he simply stood there, looking at the truck, looking at the odometer. 500,000 miles. The number felt enormous. Back when he bought the Freightliner, he would have been thrilled just to reach 100,000. Now the truck had gone 5 times farther. The engine that many people doubted was still running. The truck that nobody wanted was still working. Carl smiled at the memory, not because of the number itself, because of everything hidden inside it. The storms, the truck stops, the conversations, the friendships, the sunrises, the breakdowns, the long nights. 500,000 miles wasn't a number. It was a collection of moments, a collection of years. As darkness settled over Kansas, Carl climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and continued east. Because freight still needed to be delivered. The road doesn't stop for milestones. Neither do truck drivers. Outside the diner, a light breeze moved across the parking lot. The old Freightliner remained beneath the lamp. Still standing, still waiting. Carl stared at it quietly. Funny thing is, he paused. When I hit 500,000, I started thinking about buying a new truck. That caught my attention immediately. A new truck? Carl nodded. For the first time. The statement hung in the air, because after everything I'd heard, it was difficult to imagine him driving anything else. The Freightliner and Carl seemed inseparable, yet the thought made sense. The truck was aging. Repairs were becoming more frequent. Technology was changing. Newer trucks offered more comfort, better fuel economy, more power, and many drivers around him had already upgraded. One by one, year after year, the pressure slowly built. Friends suggested it. Mechanics mentioned it. Dispatchers hinted at it. Even Carl occasionally found himself looking at newer models. Shiny paint, modern interiors, digital dashboards. Everything the Freightliner wasn't. For the first time in years, doubt appeared. Maybe it was time. Maybe the old truck had earned retirement. Maybe 500,000 miles was enough. Carl glanced through the diner window once more, toward the Freightliner, toward the machine that had carried him across so much of America. The expression on his face told me exactly what was coming next. Because sometimes the hardest decision isn't buying something new. It's deciding whether you're ready to let go of something old. And somewhere beyond that decision waited the next chapter of the story. A chapter that would bring Carl closer than ever to selling the Freightliner, and closer than ever to the million-mile mark. For a while, neither of us spoke. The parking lot outside remained quiet. Rows of sleeping trucks stretched beneath the lights. The old Freightliner sat among them. Not the newest, not the cleanest, not the most impressive, yet somehow it was the one I kept looking at. 500,000 miles. The number still echoed in my mind. Most trucks never reach that point. Many disappear long before. But the Freightliner kept going. Even so, I understood what Carl meant. There comes a moment when every owner-operator starts doing the math. Fuel costs, maintenance costs, downtime, repairs. The numbers slowly become harder to ignore. And the older the truck becomes, the louder those numbers seem. Carl stared into his coffee. The first time I looked at a new truck, I felt guilty. I laughed. Guilty? He nodded, like I was cheating on the Freightliner. The words sounded ridiculous, yet somehow I understood exactly what he meant. After enough years, a truck becomes more than equipment. Not because it's alive, because it witnesses your life. The long days, the difficult years, the victories, the failures. It becomes part of the scenery of your memories. Carl remembered the first dealership clearly. A large lot outside Dallas. Bright lights. Perfectly polished trucks. Everything looked new. Everything looked expensive. Rows of gleaming Peterbilts and Kenworths stood beneath the Texas sun. Their chrome reflected the light. Their paint looked flawless. Compared to them, the Freightliner seemed ancient. Carl parked near the edge of the lot, stepped out, and started walking. For the first time in years, he seriously imagined driving something else. The sales representative appeared almost immediately. Friendly, confident, well-practiced. The man greeted Carl with a smile. Looking to upgrade? Upgrade. Interesting word. Carl smiled slightly as he remembered it. Back then, he wasn't sure if that's what he wanted. The salesman led him through the lot, showing features, showing technology, showing comfort, everything modern trucks offered. The sleeper cabins felt larger. The dashboards looked futuristic. The seats felt luxurious. Compared to the Freightliner, they seemed like spaceships. For a while, Carl allowed himself to imagine it. A brand new truck. No rattles, no leaks, no unexpected repairs. Just reliability, comfort, peace of mind. The idea was tempting, very tempting. The salesman eventually stopped beside a beautiful long-nosed Peterbilt. Fresh paint, polished wheels, spotless interior. The kind of truck that turns heads at truck stops. Carl climbed inside, closed the door, looked around. Everything smelled new. The gauges sparkled. The seats were perfect. The steering wheel showed no signs of wear. For a moment, he sat there quietly, trying to picture himself driving it, trying to imagine future memories being made inside that cab. But something felt strange. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. The salesman continued talking, discussing financing, fuel savings, warranty coverage. Carl listened politely, yet part of his mind had drifted elsewhere, back toward the Freightliner waiting outside, back toward the truck that had carried him through Wyoming snowstorms, through Montana mountains, through Arizona heat, the truck that had survived 500,000 miles. Eventually, Carl thanked the salesman, climbed down, and walked back across the lot. The Freightliner waited exactly where he had left it. Its paint was faded. Its chrome was worn. Its bumper carried the scars of countless miles. Yet standing there beside it felt oddly comforting. Carl placed a hand on the driver's door. The metal felt warm from the Texas sun. And suddenly, a realization appeared. Not dramatic, not emotional. Simple. He wasn't ready. At least not yet. The Freightliner still had more road left in it. More stories, more miles, more life. Carl climbed back into the cab, started the engine. The familiar rumble filled the air, and somehow that sound felt better than any new truck smell. The Freightliner rolled away from the dealership, back toward the highway, back toward another load. For a while, the temptation disappeared. Months passed, then years. The odometer continued climbing. 600,000, 650,000, 700,000. The numbers grew larger. The truck grew older. Yet somehow, both kept moving. Then came a winter that changed everything. Carl's expression shifted slightly. The kind of expression people make when approaching a difficult memory. Outside, the wind moved across the parking lot. The Freightliner remained beneath the lights. Silent, patient, waiting. And for the first time all night, I had the feeling that the next story might not have a happy ending. Because somewhere beyond 700,000 miles, the road would ask a very difficult question. And neither Carl nor the Freightliner knew the answer yet. The night outside seemed even quieter now. Most of the trucks in the parking lot had gone dark. Their drivers were asleep, preparing for another day on the road. Only a handful of marker lights still glowed in the darkness. Tiny orange reflections scattered across the asphalt. The old Freightliner remained beneath its lamp. Still, patient, waiting. Carl watched it for a moment, then slowly nodded. 700,000 miles. The number hung in the air. Back when he bought the truck, 700,000 miles would have sounded impossible. Now it was simply another milestone that had quietly arrived. The years had continued passing. Loads came and went. Routes changed. Customers changed. The Freightliner remained. Its paint had faded further. Its seats carried the shape of countless days. Its engine no longer sounded quite as young as it once had. But it still worked. Morning after morning. State after state. Year after year. Then came the winter. The winter Carl still remembered more clearly than most. Not because of a storm. Not because of an accident. Because of a decision. It began in Colorado. Late January. The mountains were buried beneath fresh snow. Cold air filled every valley. The roads remained open. But conditions were far from easy. Carl had completed hundreds of winter runs by then. Experience had replaced confidence. The two look similar, but they're very different things. Confidence believes nothing will happen. Experience understands that something always can. The Freightliner climbed steadily through the mountains, its engine working harder with every grade. The truck wasn't struggling, but it wasn't effortless anymore either. Age was becoming impossible to ignore. Long climbs took longer. Cold mornings required more patience. Repairs appeared more frequently. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to keep reminding him. The years were catching up. One evening, after a particularly difficult day in the mountains, Carl pulled into a truck stop west of Denver. Snow covered the parking lot. The wind moved across the open spaces between trailers. The Freightliner looked tired. At least that's how Carl remembered it. For a long moment, he sat in the driver's seat after shutting down the engine, listening. The familiar ticking sounds filled the cab, metal cooling after a long day. Normally those sounds felt comforting. Not that night. That night they felt old. The thought surprised him, because for years he had defended the truck. To mechanics, to friends, to dispatchers. Every time someone suggested replacing it, he had dismissed the idea. Now the thought had appeared on its own. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was time. The idea stayed with him for weeks. Every repair invoice seemed larger. Every maintenance bill seemed more difficult to justify. The Freightliner was still earning money, but it was also demanding more attention, more time, more parts, more patience. Eventually, Carl began looking at truck listings again. Not casually this time. Seriously. New trucks. Used trucks. Anything that might replace the Freightliner. The search slowly became a habit. Coffee in one hand, truck advertisements in the other. The more he looked, the more logical the decision seemed. A newer truck would reduce downtime, improve fuel economy, provide more comfort. Every calculation pointed toward replacement. Logic had made its case. The problem was that trucking isn't always logical. Some decisions happen on paper. Others happen somewhere deeper. Weeks later, Carl found himself parked at a dealership once again. This one was larger than the previous lot. Rows of modern trucks stretched across the property. Everything looked impressive. The sales manager greeted him warmly. Within an hour, Carl was discussing numbers, trade-in values, financing options, monthly payments. For the first time, everything felt real. The Freightliner wasn't just aging anymore. It was becoming something he might actually leave behind. The paperwork sat on the desk between them. The salesman smiled. "We can make this very easy." Carl believed him. That was the strange part. The deal made sense. The numbers worked. The truck was beautiful. Everything aligned perfectly. Yet something felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not enough to explain. Just wrong. The salesman stepped away briefly to print additional paperwork. Carl remained alone in the office. The room was quiet. Through the window, he could see the parking lot. And there, beyond rows of shiny new trucks, sat the Freightliner, older than everything around it. Less valuable, less modern, less impressive. Yet somehow it was the only truck he wanted to look at. Snow from the previous storm still clung to portions of the cab. The paint was faded. The bumper carried scars. The truck looked exactly like 700,000 miles should look. Carl stared at it for a long time. Memories began appearing. Wyoming, Montana, Arizona, Nevada. The million small moments hidden between them. Truck stops, sunrises, storms, friendships, entire years of life. None of those memories existed inside the new truck. Every one of them existed inside the old one. The realization hit him unexpectedly. He wasn't buying transportation. He was considering ending a chapter, a very long chapter. When the salesman returned, Carl was still looking through the window. "Ready?" Carl smiled politely, then shook his head. "Not today." The salesman looked surprised. Carl couldn't blame him. The deal had been close. Very close. Close enough that even now he sometimes wonders what would have happened if he had signed the papers. But he didn't. Instead, he walked back across the lot, back toward the Freightliner. The winter air felt sharp, cold, clean. Carl opened the driver's door, climbed inside, and settled into the familiar seat. The cab smelled exactly the same as it always had. A mixture of coffee, diesel, dust, and time. The key turned. The engine came to life. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but honestly. The old Freightliner rumbled beneath him. The same sound he had heard for years. The same sound that had carried him across hundreds of thousands of miles. Carl smiled, then pulled away from the dealership. The new trucks disappeared in the mirrors. The highway appeared ahead. And just like that, the decision was made. The Freightliner had earned a little more road, a little more time, a few more miles. Neither of them knew exactly how many, but both were about to discover the answer. Outside the diner, the first faint hint of dawn was beginning to appear along the eastern horizon. Night still held the sky, but morning was getting closer. And somewhere ahead waited the number nobody had seriously believed possible all those years ago. 800,000 miles, 900,000 miles, and eventually, 1 million. The diner had grown quieter than ever. Only a few customers remained. Most sat alone, enjoying the final peaceful hours before dawn. Outside, the eastern horizon carried the faintest trace of light. Not enough to call it morning, but enough to know the night would not last forever. The old Freightliner stood exactly where it had been all evening, beneath the same lamp, beneath the same Nebraska sky. Carl looked at it and smiled. After that winter, something changed. I nodded. The decision had been made. The Freightliner had survived another chance to be replaced. And somehow, that decision seemed to affect both truck and driver. The miles continued accumulating. 800,000, then 850,000, then 900,000. Numbers that once sounded impossible now arrived quietly. The years moved faster than before. At least that's how Carl remembered them. The road remained familiar. The Freightliner remained reliable. Not perfect, never perfect, but dependable. The repairs never completely disappeared. A hose here, a bearing there, an alternator one year, a starter another. The usual collection of problems that accompany old machinery. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, just life. Carl often joked that keeping the Freightliner running had become a hobby disguised as a business. The mechanics laughed, because they knew exactly what he meant. One particular mechanic had known the truck for nearly 15 years. Every time Carl arrived, the man would shake his head. "You're still driving this thing?" The answer never changed. "Still driving it." The mechanic would laugh, then get to work. As the years passed, people began recognizing the Freightliner. Not because it was beautiful, not because it was famous, because it kept showing up. Truck stops in Iowa, fuel stations in Oklahoma, repair shops in Missouri. Drivers would occasionally walk over, point toward the odometer, and ask the same question. "How many miles now?" Carl smiled as he remembered those conversations. Everyone seemed genuinely curious, perhaps because so few trucks remain on the road long enough to tell stories. By the time the odometer passed 900,000 miles, the Freightliner had become something unusual, a survivor. Not many people expected it to get that far. To be honest, Carl wasn't entirely sure it would either. Yet there it was, still working, still earning its keep, still chasing horizons. The closer the truck came to 1 million miles, the more often people talked about it. Friends mentioned it. Mechanics mentioned it. Other drivers mentioned it. The number had become real. Close enough to imagine. Close enough to reach. One evening, while crossing Missouri, Carl found himself doing the math. The Freightliner needed less than 20,000 miles, then less than 10,000, then less than 5,000. Each trip felt slightly different. Not because the truck had changed, because Carl had. For the first time, he found himself paying attention to every mile, every sunrise, every truck stop, every familiar stretch of highway. The road somehow felt more valuable, not because it was ending, because he knew a milestone was approaching. The million-mile mark had become a destination of its own, a destination hidden inside countless smaller destinations. Months later, it finally happened. Carl remembered the day perfectly, not because anything extraordinary happened, because almost nothing happened at all. The weather was pleasant. The road was dry. Traffic was light. A simple day, the kind of day truck drivers experience thousands of times. The Freightliner was traveling east across Kansas, the same state where 500,000 miles had arrived years earlier. Carl smiled when he noticed that coincidence. Kansas again. Long roads, wide skies, endless fields. The odometer slowly approached the number 999,990, 999,991, 999,992. Carl turned off the radio. The cab became quiet. The engine continued its familiar rhythm, a sound he had heard for decades. 999,995, 999,996, 999,997, 999,998, 999,999. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Then the odometer rolled forward. 1 million miles. The number sat there quietly, almost casually. No fireworks, no celebration, no dramatic music, just another mile. And yet somehow, it felt different. Carl laughed softly as he remembered it. I couldn't believe it. The truck had done it. More importantly, they had done it. Together. Carl eased onto the shoulder, stopped the Freightliner, and shut down the engine. The Kansas wind moved gently through the grass. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky. Everything felt calm. For several minutes, he simply sat there, looking at the odometer. 1 million miles. A number that had once seemed impossible. A number that now sat directly in front of him. Eventually, he climbed down from the cab. The Freightliner stood quietly beside the road. Its paint faded, its chrome worn, its age impossible to hide. And somehow it had never looked better. Carl walked slowly around the truck, remembering Wyoming snowstorms, Montana mountains, Arizona deserts, Nevada breakdowns, truck stops, sunrises, conversations, friendships, entire chapters of life, all hidden inside that number. 1 million miles. Not a measurement, a story, perhaps many stories. Carl smiled toward the horizon, then climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and continued driving, because freight still needed to be delivered, and because the road always continues. Outside the diner, dawn was finally arriving. Soft lights spread across the Nebraska sky. The parking lot lights began fading, their work nearly finished. Carl looked through the window at the Freightliner. The old truck now sat beneath the first light of morning. For a while, neither of us spoke. There didn't seem to be much left to say. The story had traveled 1 million miles, and somehow brought us right back where it started, at a quiet diner, at a truck stop, on an ordinary night, or perhaps an extraordinary one. Carl finished the last of his coffee, then stood. Outside, morning had fully arrived. The Freightliner waited patiently, ready for another trip, ready for another sunrise, ready for another road. Carl reached for his jacket. Before leaving, he glanced back toward me. You know something? What? He smiled. I still drive it. I laughed. For some reason, that answer felt perfect. Because some stories don't really end. They just keep rolling down the highway. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the old Freightliner was still adding miles. One road at a time. That's where my story ends tonight. If you'd like to hear more from the road, hit subscribe and rest easy, my friend.